I'd like to start, Jennifer, with your subtitle, just to kind of define the main terms here and also to delve into your argument. So it's in English, liberate our classics from a masculine gaze. In the book, since you move from plays to fairy tales to memoirs to novels, how do you define classics? And can you also define male gaze, and why have these classics been enslaved, as it were, by the male gaze for so long?
Thank you for those two great questions. So it's very difficult to translate the title. So if you have will be to translate into English. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Is that better? Okay. Yeah. So the question about translation, saying no, or she said no, that the first title, and then libérer les classiques. So what are the classics? To be honest, in the sense of in French, classics means that is studied in the classroom. Classic comes from classroom, and we don't hear that, but it's basically the literature. You go to school and you are, invited to study it because it is seen as the canon, the French canon. So that's the first thing. And what is a male gaze? My understanding is that this French canon has been taught at school. That was decided in the 19th century by intellectuals in the 19th century. What will we teach at school? What we will not teach? And how to erase the woman, like they decided, okay, this author, we take it, this other author, we don't take it. And that's how you build anthologies, by erasing people and deciding these authors will be studied or not. And so my understanding is that this reception is a reception that I call the male gaze, because it's, male authors, and I can drop names here, Sainte-Beuve, Victor Cousin, all those authors who decided to study those texts with a certain gaze, meaning a certain understanding of those classical texts. So I want to revisit two things. I want to do two different things. Enlarging the French canon by including female authors, that's the first thing. And the second thing, changing our perception of the French canon by, looking at Racine or Laclos, those people who are seen as the French canon, but through different eyes, and to look at the perspectives of the plays through the eyes of the heroines. Does it make sense?
Yes, those are exactly what I identified as your two main projects too. So I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yeah.
It seems that one way to expand the canon is in terms of form. So I mentioned plays, fairy tales. Yes. I mean, immediately that's maybe a non-traditional form. Why was that one way to kind of enlarge the canon, by enlarging it formally?
So fairy tales are very important because the way we know fairy tales, the way I've been taught fairy tales, was first Walt Disney, so from the perspective of the movies. But it's interesting because the first people who wrote fairy tale, I'm speaking about the tradition of writing fairy tales, because originally it's, oral. It's an oral tradition, a folkloric tradition, and we lost traces of this oral tradition. But the first writing, the written form of the fairy tale was a form taken by women, because it was seen as something that was not important. Who cares about fairy tales? And so in the 17th century, female authors were the first person to write fairy tales, and they wanted to address the notion of sexual consent through fairy tales. So fairy tales were not meant to be read by little children. They were meant to be read by young women who didn't choose their wedding night or didn't choose their husband, who were discovering a perfect stranger in their bed, who were not ready to have sex, And that's the reason why fairy tales written by women in the 17th century have nothing to do with the fairy tales we know through, the Disney industry, or even movies by Cocteau. So I speak about Beauty and the Beast, the surrealism tradition. All those traditions have been covering a female tradition because it's female. So we know, everybody knows Perrault. When I was a kid, people were reading Perrault to me, but nobody read Madame de Villeneuve or Madame d'Aulnoy or Mademoiselle de Murat. All those women were the first to write fairy tales. So that's why I thought it was such an important take to listen, because all the fairy tales are a way to educate women to say no, to refuse what's going on. So it's an education about refusal.
And we're gonna dive into a specific example. Briefly, just also tell us about the memoir as a form, as a genre as well.
So memoir, in the 17th century, you all know this sentence that le moi est haïssable. The self is despicable. It's not good to speak about oneself. We should speak about God and everything. So it's interesting to see that a lot of women have been writing memoirs. Mademoiselle de Montpensier, Marie Mancini, Hortense Mancini, Madame de Laguette. And it's so interesting because they speak about many different experiences about what it means to become a mother, what it means to protect your castle when your husband is sent to the war and you're here, what it means to marry your children, because we always think, oh, women, they stay at home, they don't do anything, but they were negotiating alliances. They were, doing a lot of diplomatic things. So I thought memoir was a very nice way to understand those women.
Thank you. So that's a kind of overview, if you like, of what's at stake here. We'll delve into some particulars. I want to pull back briefly and think about from whence this book came. You talk about this in the prologue. It was inspired by the Me Too movement. And you also, as you were responding to the Me Too movement, you yourself are an expert of the 17th century. You mentioned it twice already. We'll talk about why it's such an important century and why you chose to spend so much time intellectually there. But precisely, you were responding to the Me Too movement and you were saying to yourself, I think that the literature from the 17th century has something to say as part of the Me Too movement. Can you tell us about these two inspirations?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So, so I'm French, you can tell, but I live in the US for 16 years now. And so it's very interesting to see how people perceive French literature in different ways. So for instance, when you are French and when you are born in France and you are raised in France and you go to school and you study the classic, people tell you, the 17th century is le Grand Siècle, the most important century because of Versailles, because of Louis XIV, because of Molière, Corneille, Racine, and everybody is in awe, with 17th century. And then you go to the US and nobody cares, right? And you go to the classroom to teach, and the students, my students, told me, you're really nice, madam, but we don't really care about things that happened before the French Revolution, because basically before the French Revolution, it's just aristocracy, and there's a reason why we cut the head, right? And, it's like retrograde. They have nothing to, teach us. But that was at the beginning of my career. And then step by step, people became very suspicious towards, French culture seen as an empire. And, they were more interested in post-colonial studies. So at some point, a lot of students told me, we cannot learn anything from dead white men. We are not interested. It doesn't, appeal to us. It doesn't speak about us. They pay a lot of money. I mean, I teach at Rutgers, which is a public university, but it's still a lot of money for people, to pay and study and understand what to do with literature. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the Me Too movement. And that became even harder for me because what happened with the Me Too movement, I don't know if you were in France at that time, but like 1 year later, we had this tribune in Le Monde with Catherine saying, we advocate for a right to be bothered in the name of gallantry. Do you remember? And so all my students were like, see, madame, what you teach is just the rape culture. Your gallantry, this way of romantic relationships and love you advocate for, it's just part of the rape culture. We are not interested in this. And so the way I understand 17th century is also interesting because we call 17th century l'âge galant, the gallant age. Why? Because the notion of consent is very important in this century because of two different traditions. On one side, you have the nobility, you know, that is interested in sealing alliances between families, you know, expanding, you know, their house or their, you know, their wealth, and they are not interested in consent at all. And so women or men are not consulted. But on the other side, you have the church, and the church is advocating for consent because they think if you love each other, then you will be more faithful and love God in a better way. So you have this tension in the 17th century between two traditions, and you see these tensions that is core to fairy tales and all those things. So then I thought, okay, maybe I have something to say about gallantry, because gallantry was exactly a literary movement that was seen as a soft rebellion against this society, a way for women and men to think about love, to speak about love. Women were seen as people who need to be silenced. And so because of the preciosity, because of Mademoiselle de Scudéry, because of the salon where people were able to see each other, to meet, to talk, to define love, and to write novels about love, it changes the relationship between people. And I told my students, and I wrote that book as a pedagogical answer to say, maybe gallantry has something to, you know, bring to us. Maybe we can see it with a female gaze, because what we know about gallantry is a very diminished way of conception of seeing gallantry. We see gallantry to the male gaze. It's basically holding the door and paying the bill, which has nothing to do with gallantry. So that's why I thought it was interesting to take all those critiques into consideration, to try to answer those critiques and give another understanding of gallantry.
And also to, really importantly, and this is why I think the project of the book is so important now, especially with what's happening in America, to nuance the conversation about what's being taught and how it's taught. So we'll talk about that. One other piece of background I wanted to ask you about is just the relationship between this book and your academic research. You said in a recent interview of your previous work, so your PhD dissertation was turned into a book. I wanted to approach the declaration of love in Racine through silence. And in this book, I wanted to attack consent from the angle of refusal. So each time it's a kind of oblique approach. And so maybe you can talk about this oblique approach in both cases, and also how you see this book in relation to your long academic career, because this is obviously a public-facing book. You're using the eye, you're speaking in public forums like this.
Thank you. Your questions are so dense. I try to be short. So yes, I fell in love with Racine. I don't know if you know Racine, but I would be happy to speak about Racine all my life, and with you in particular, because it's such a wonderful author that speaks about, you know, not only love, but what it means to make a decision and to make a declaration. So basically, each play of Racine revolves around something that is impossible to declare, whether it be incest, whether it be, you know, separation when you love someone and you don't want to break up, whether it be declaring you're Jewish when all the Jews are condemned to death. I mean, it's so rich. Each play is so powerful. That was my first passion. And I wrote a PhD about that for the Sorbonne. But at the same time, it was interesting because I also went to Stanford to write another PhD about who has the authority to speak, what it means to speak in the 17th and 18th century, in the religious sphere, in the love sphere. Who has the right to declare their love in 17th and 18th century? What does it mean to say to someone you love them, and what does it change? And what is the agenda behind the declaration of love? And so you see that it's interesting because this is the background of my theory, that behind the declaration you have to break the silence. So that's why I studied Racine through the lens of silence, because there's many ways of not saying. Silence is not you're not saying something. It's you can say a lot of things and being silent because you avoid speaking about what people ask you to speak about. So the notion of consent is also very interesting, because consent in the 17th century, if you look at the dictionary, at that time, the dictionary of Furtière, you have different way of understanding the word consent. It could be an active way. So you say yes, okay? So that's the first definition of consent. The second definition of consent in the 17th century is you consent by not opposing. And basically you're silent, okay? So that's why I thought, okay, this is interesting, because there's a part of silence in the notion of consent. And so that's why I'm interested in the plays of Racine. But it's also interesting that to understand the consent, you can just examine the answers when people are saying yes. But it's also very interesting to take into account when people are saying no, because the reason why sometimes we don't understand consent is because we don't take no as an answer, for an answer. And so my perspective in the book is to show that when women say no in the texts themselves, they are not understood by the characters themselves, their male counterparts. And so this way of not understanding the no that is portrayed, in plays, in novels, that we teach in class, that reproduces the way we don't understand female refusal. So that's why I wanted to understand, consent by saying no, because I thought, okay, we always examine the yes part. And Manon is doing that in La Conversation des Sexes, the joy of consent, it will be. But I was interested in understanding the refusal.
And what's so lovely, of course, is that you made the same intellectual move in your previous academic book. So let's go back to the two main projects. One, just to remind everyone, of course, you'll buy the book, so you'll have it next to your bed, and then it will be imprinted in your brain. On the one hand, rereading the male canon, let's say, with a feminist gaze. On the other hand, enlarging this male canon to produce what you call a matrimoine. Matrimoine, which is your word?
No, so matrimoine, so that's a cancelled word. Matrimoine is a word that exists in the Middle Age. A lot of French people are like, oh, matrimoine, it's a neologism. Oh, la, 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 la. These woke people, they create words. No, it's a word that was created in the 16th century to say that it's all the goods that the mother gives, in a wedding. And so basically the matrimoine is just the culture, the literary text produced by women. But in French, we say patrimoine for everything. Everything is patrimoine. Madame de Lafayette, patrimoine. Madame de Sévigné, patrimoine. Okay, so the notion of matrimoine is interesting because it's a word that comes back, but it existed. The same like autrice. Everyone, autrice. No, it's not a new word. It's a word from the 17th century, just as actrice, directrice. It comes from Latin. I didn't make it up.
So I want to go to the first thrust of the argument, which is to kind of train your readers how to re-examine, let's say, classically male texts with this feminist gaze. Can you tell us specifically how the book educates the reader to read again and read with new eyes, feminist eyes?
Yes, great question. So I will just take one example, Andromaque. In English, you say
Andromache.
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 Yes, by Racine. Okay, so a lot of feminist discourse Nazis were saying, you know, we don't like Racine because everything goes wrong in Racine's plays, and women don't have any agency. They all die. They commit suicide. They are not good examples. We should cancel Racine. I'm not oversimplifying. I really heard those things. And in fact, if you take just Andromache, okay, Andromache is not a myth that Racine created. It's something that was created, you know, it's a myth that I'm sure you read, Euripides, Seneca, Homer, Virgil, I mean, you name it. The stories were created, and in the 17th century, the way you innovate, it's very different nowadays. But in the 17th century, when you want to create something and be original, you borrow myths that everybody knows, and you make them new, basically. And so the understanding of Andromache, if you remember, it's a woman. She's a you know, the only person who survived after the Troy War. And so all the Trojans have been destroyed. Her husband, Hector, you know, everybody is dead. Just some women are, you know, alive, and their children. And basically the Greeks are here to say, okay, we're going to share the women and we're going to kill the kids. And basically we're going to rape the women. So that's an innuendo. And so Seneca is really clear about that. And so Pyrrhus arrives and said to Andromache, okay, either you marry me or I kill your child. You have the choice. And so there is this dilemma. And when you go to, you know, the classroom in the anthology, basically what people make you study is this dilemma. When Pyrrhus says, you're going to marry me, I'm going to kill your child. And you're like, oh, she's a victim, you know, what will she say? It's horrible. But that's the only thing you study. And nowadays, when I talk to people, because I'm invited to a lot of places, even grown-up adults or people who are very well versed in, you know, literature, they say, oh, Andromache is a victim because she dies, or, you know, her son dies at the end. And if you read Seneca, Euripides, all the sources, the son of Andromache dies, and she becomes the sexual slave of Pyrrhus in Euripides, for example. But Racine creates something totally different. He makes the etymology of Andromache very active. Andromache in Greek, andros makein, it means the woman who fight men. That's what it means. It's a cool name, right? So she really fights, she resists, and at the end, she succeeds because she becomes the queen. Her son, you know, survives, and Pyrrhus dies. So it has nothing to do. So he recreates something totally new, something that, you know, shows the power of women, even when you're, you know, a prisoner of war, a survivor. He makes something totally new that we forget, and so that's why I think Racine is so powerful, because he knows Latin, Greek, he knows everything. He read, is like a geek, like he read everything, he knows everything by heart, but he's creating something that has nothing to do with the sources. And he's very smart, because in his prefaces, he said, oh, I follow the steps of Aristotle, I followed, you know, these sources, but in fact, it does something totally new and very inspiring. So that's why I think that there is a misunderstanding here.
So I want to, that's one example. I want to go into two more examples just to give you a sense of, again, what are the tools that Jennifer equips you with when you're rereading or reading for the first time stories and novels. So can you tell us about Madame de Villeneuve's 1740 telling of Beauty and the Beast, and why beauty is in fact not the captive of the beast after all, as we might know it today?
Yeah, thank you. I love this example. That's one of my favorites. So basically, I don't know if you remember in 2017 when the Me Too movement emerged. Do you remember in the US what were the movies everybody wanted to know? It was before COVID. People were, you know, lining up before going to the movie theater. Do you remember the blockbusters in 2017, just before Me Too? Beauty and the Beast, 2017, right? and 50 Shades of Grey, which is in English is
50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah. So both of them advocate for the Stockholm syndrome, right? So I was like, okay, maybe we need to change something about our scripts. And so it's very interesting because when you speak to people, people say, oh, Beauty and the Beast, I know what it is about. It's about a woman. She's, the prisoner of a man, but magically the guy is awful, but she falls in love with him and marries him, right? And so this is another misunderstanding, a male gaze, because if you read at the 1740 fairy tale written by Madame de Villeneuve, it's totally different. It's basically, so Beauty comes to the castle of the beast and to replace her father. So it's like a trade, but out of charity, she wants to save her father. She comes to the castle, but the beast told the father, if you send your daughters, she has to come willingly. Otherwise, I don't want her. She has to come willingly. So this adverb is very important. So she comes, and the beast, and tell your daughter how full I am. Because when you look at Disney, he's kind of cute. You want to hug him. He looks like a bear or a lion, whatever, a furry animal. It's kind of nice. When you read the description of Villeneuve, he has, a trompe. He has some clouds. It's really, really awful. And so the beast tell your daughter that I'm ugly, I do a lot of noise, but she has to come willingly. Okay, because there is a spell, and the spell was imposed on him by a fairy that said, who said, you can be saved by a woman, but you cannot force that woman. If you force her, then the spell doesn't break. So the woman arrives, Belle arrives, and they have this conversation. And as soon as he meets her, he's like, do you want to sleep with me? Not, would you marry me, like Disney? Would you like to sleep with me? Voulez-vous coucher avec moi? So in French, coucher can mean have sex, but it can also mean go to bed. Collocare in Latin, coucher, collocataire. Ouais. And she says, and she starts, being so afraid. And he said, no, don't be afraid. You can say yes, or you can say no, and I will not be offended, whatever you say. And she said, okay, no. And and he said, okay, fine. And she describes, the castle as a place where it's so interesting to go because there's no forbidden room. She gets to go to the theater, to the opera. She participates to political missions. She's meeting people. So it's a very good place to be. And every night he meets with her and say, do you enjoy yourself? How do you like being here? Can I do something to make your stay more pleasant? It's very nice to her. But every night, do you want to sleep with me? And she says no. And it's very interesting to see how she educates herself to. It's very difficult to say no one time, to say no 2 times, but to keep saying no. Okay. And it's also very interesting because at night she has erotic dreams. And so there is a very good description about how she meets this charming prince, and she has all this pleasant conversation where he tries to manipulate her, to flirt with her, but she's super safe because it's just a dream. So during the night, she has pleasant dream. During the day, she entertains herself, and at night, she has dinner with this beast who wants to have sex with her or to sleep with her. And then at some point, she's fed up and she said, look, it's nice, but I want to go back to my father's place. And he says, fine, you can leave, but if you don't come after 2 months, I will die. But you can do whatever you want. You're free to leave. And so she stayed more than 2 months. She comes back after 3 months. When she comes back, he looks dead. And she's like, oh no, she discovers when she's, aware that she feels for him, and because he was a nice person. And then she tries to wake him up, but not by kissing him, but by putting some, water on him. And then, he wakes up and says, oh, you came back. And so she declares her love. She said, I've been missing you. I love you. And say, oh, yes, so let's have dinner. And would you like to sleep with me? And then she says, yes, I will sleep with you, but at one condition, you marry me. So she proposed to him. So it's very interesting. And he said, of course, I will marry you. And then say, so would you sleep with me? And say, yes. And so they go to bed, and he sleeps. And she's like, oh, It's really a beast. Like, it's really literal. He goes to sleep. And then she falls, she sleeps also. And she sees in her dream this magic prince. And when she wakes up, the beast became the prince. And she's like, oh, he's so handsome and he's asleep. I'm going to kiss him 1,000 times because nobody knows. Nobody's watching me. And after all, he's going to marry me, so I can do whatever I want. And so she kisses him 1,000 times, but nothing happens. He doesn't wake up. And do you know who wakes him up? His mother. The mother arrives. No, so it's very interesting because it's a fairy tale about consent, but all the layers of consent. It's between, her, what she really wants. She tries to understand what is her desire between the erotic dreams, between this conversation. So it's consent between you and yourself. Then it's a layer of consent between her and him. And then there's another half of the story that deals about the consent between the parents, the fairies, the parents of this prince, because she's not seen as an aristocrat person. She's like just a peasant, and it's going to be a problem for the mother. But then we'll dive into the story of their origins, why he became a beast. It's so interesting. I don't want to reveal everything, but the reason why he became a beast has nothing to do with any kind of movies, It's so powerful. It's such a powerful fairy tale that speaks about, consent, sex, relationship between where you come from, where do you go, how do you leave your family to build your own family, negotiating this, journey, which is hard, how to raise children, incest, all those questions are key to even nowadays to understand people and relationships.
Yeah, I mean, not even nowadays, especially nowadays.
Yeah.
And this is what you say in the conclusion, that many of your students are saying to you, well, this concept doesn't exist and this concept doesn't exist. And you say, yes, they do exist, but they just don't have the contemporary names.
Yeah.
And this is what's so lovely. I mean, you've just had these two examples. We have Andromache and we have Belle, and really what Jennifer's doing is saying there's nothing inherently cancelable about anyone. It's just about how we, first of all, read the story and possibly who's writing it, and kind of untying the knots of how this person has been passed down through history and rewritten and reread. And so again, it's just this really deep and careful nuancing of the conversation that's happening mostly in America, that kind of simplifies and throws things out very quickly, and leaving the writers and the characters and the people who are teaching these works stranded on the wayside, saying, listen, there's more to this than you first meets your eye. I mean, literally first meets your eye, because a lot of it is kind of visual cancellation. The third example I'd like for you to speak to, in part because I think it opens up the final questions that I have about how to teach these works to contemporary classrooms, contemporary American classrooms, is the way that you link the destinies of Helen of Troy and Marilyn Monroe, because this is a brilliant move that Jennifer makes.
Yeah, it's not the favorite chapters of people sometimes, but I thought it was very interesting to think about Marilyn Monroe and Helen of Troy, because some students are like, oh, we don't know anything about Helen of Troy. Who is this person? They don't, she doesn't, we don't connect to this person or to this character. And I just answer, well, imagine the most beautiful woman you can imagine, and it's just Helen of Troy, because it was just the sex symbol of that time, right? Everybody has a story about Helen of Troy. And it's interesting because a lot of stories put the blame on Helen of Troy. She's a femme fatale, just the same way Marilyn Monroe is seen as a femme fatale or a sex symbol. And everybody says, she's responsible for, the Trojan War. It's because of her, because she loved Paris, blah, 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 blah. And if you look at different plays, there are many occurrences where, in fact, she was raped by many different warriors. She was also, it's another way of narrating this story. You can, look at this through the male gaze and say, oh, she's a sex symbol. She kills everybody. Everyone who sees her falls in love with her. She's a femme fatale. She's fatal to us because we are in love with her. But another way of narrating this story is that she's been raped, she's been kidnapped, and there is this play by Euripides that a lot of people don't know, Helen of Troy, and it's very beautiful because Euripides imagines that the wife of Zeus, Hera, wants to protect Helen, and when she's kidnapped, she puts instead a ghost, and that looks like her. But so Paris is kidnapping a fake Helen. It's not her. And it's really interesting because the real one is hidden in an island. And so I was thinking about these ghosted refusals. Basically, when you are raped and you cannot speak about your rape. And that's why I made a connection with Marilyn Monroe, because it was very interesting, because I read Marilyn Monroe's memoirs and many different, biographies and books about her. And it makes no doubt that she's been abused. But if you look at the Wikipedia, I don't know if it has changed, I didn't look, but the French Wikipedia, it's like, oh, Marilyn Monroe, she did this and this, she's a femme fatale, and there's no mention about her being raped. None. And so because we have this fantasy that those women need to be, altogether very irresistible, but untouchable. So if you say that this sex symbol that everybody is dreaming about have been raped, like a lot of women who don't say it, or abused, then they become very degraded or banal or whatever. And so that's why I wanted to make a connection between those two women to speak about the ghosted refusals.
And I also thought, and you say this in the book, you make these connections too, because you want to appeal and make relevant the material, let's say relevant to the students in the classroom. And you describe your teaching approach, which is the kind of final questions I want to ask you about. Because this book, and we were talking about it before, this book is, yes, a very close reading of some of the most famous women of literature, of history, but it's also a kind of testimony of Jennifer's time as a French academic in America. What has that been like? What's her experience? And also maybe an homage to what's the best of the French educational system and what's the best of the American educational system. And you say you take very seriously this idea of the lived experience of your students in the classroom. And I thought that's why the Marilyn Monroe was an example, because it shows the flexibility with which you're teaching this material. Can you talk about this, the American pedagogy that you've encountered, and maybe why France would do well to be open to people expressing their first person opinion, acknowledging, let's say, as you say, the lived experience. And this is not at all your experience. You went to a prépa, you went to Louis le Grand, then you went to the Sorbonne. And so you had your identity beaten out of you.
Yeah.
As I'm sure anyone who's French in the room has had.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a good question. I love my students. I always wanted to teach. It's that since I'm a little girl, I fell in love when I was, I think, 14 years old with Tristan and Isolde. When I had this French course, and I came back home and I told my mother, I love literature. I want to be a teacher of literature. And she said, no, you'll do math. And so I'm very sympathetic with my students who think that literature is useless, because that's what my mother thought. She was not interested in literature. And so that's the first common point we have. Like, I understand perfectly when people say literature is useless and we shouldn't focus on literature, because that was my own struggle with my own mother. And I love my mother immensely. But she really thought, because she was a very smart person and she was not able to go to school, and she wanted, the best out of school, and she came from Egypt, and so she had to struggle. There is this notion of immigration that when you come to a country, you need to fit in. You need to fit, and you need to do the best things, and literature is not the best thing. You need to earn money, you need to have a good living, you need to struggle. And my father was all into school because they were very smart people, but they couldn't go to school as much. And so I remember, like, it was very important for them that I speak French very well. I have a very good spelling, no mistakes, so they didn't speak Creole at home, or they didn't speak Arabic, even though they knew those languages, because they wanted just us to be French, right? And so I learned all this literature by passion because I was interested. But when I arrived in the US, I was, interested that US is so diverse. There are so many different people from so many different backgrounds, and they are not interested in literature, especially 17th century, right? And I totally understand that, and I'm not offended at all because that's my background. So I, identify with those students because we have that in common. And especially in New Jersey, where I teach, New Jersey, that a lot of people come from everywhere. So I think that the power of literature and the way I understand my mission is to create this space where everybody can come with their experience, where their language, where their, also their anger sometimes, or their passions, or their questions. And literature is as such a powerful, powerful way of creating empathy and trying to understand the other. It's a way to open doors and to identify to people, or identify to objects, or identify to any type of characters. So that's why I try to bring in the classroom is my own experience, having the feeling that I never fit anywhere, and that's okay with that, right? And also I remember like being trained in the best schools in France and being nobody. Like, people always told me, you cannot understand the text the way you understand them, because that's not right. You need to understand the way we teach it. We need to impose knowledge on yourself because we know the professors and we speak from, an arena, and that's the way we teach in France. And when I arrived in the US, I was so amazed that everything is based on conversation. And I try to, talk to people and, start from where they are and what they know, and build the knowledge around what they know, around what they're interested in, and build a conversation. And not impose my views, because I understand that I don't know everything. And I understand that because I'm a scholar now and I read everyone's views on those classical texts, we all have a take on them. So I'm not the one who said, hey, I know the truth. But I say that's the power of literature, is to open doors and open interpretation and try to justify those interpretation. And that's where I discover also trigger warnings, and I really take that seriously, because if you believe that literature has the power to move you, to, open doors, or, arouse souvenirs or trauma or things that happen to you, then you believe in trigger warnings. And I remember being, a student and being at school in France and having some professor who were making fun of women being raped or being stupid for being raped or all those things. And I remember being a young woman saying, I don't relate to that. I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand why it's funny. I don't like the way they describe those texts, La Princesse de Clèves, this frigid girl that doesn't like sex, and that's why she doesn't want to marry the Duc de Nemours, ha ha ha. And so I was shocked. And so that's why I tried not to reproduce that in the classroom. And that's actually is a nice way to have conversations with even, women or still nowadays in New Jersey, they cannot shoot their husband. They are, and it's really interesting that some Indian women tell me, my parents, they arranged my marriage, but I'm okay with that because they know best. And they're this couple who they are a happy couple and they know better what is a good marriage or not because I don't have experience. And so that's why I'm interested in 17th century texts. But, it's very interesting because is passion a key for happiness in a wedding? That's a good question we ask and we examine together. So I think when you open it up, when you say, okay, I don't know, maybe you will not like it, but this is also your literature. It's my literature because I made it mine, but it's also yours. And I think it's a good base for conversation.
Thank you. Can we have a final round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's lots to dive into, and we really just brushed the surface because there are many more chapters with many more examples. Are there any in-person audience questions? And I will refer you to Alfonso, who has the mic. And if you're French, you're welcome to ask a question in French, so don't hesitate.
I actually came late, so you might have already talked about this. I was going to ask you, is there a woman in literature who you've always looked up to, who's kind of been an icon for you personally?
Yes, to the despair of my mother. It was La Princesse de Clèves. I was in love with this novel, Madame de Lafayette, the way that she describes, feelings, introspection, understanding, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand how to court someone. Is there a good way of courting or not a good way? How the relationship between her and her mother. I think it's so powerful. It's such a beautiful text. And I remember reading this with passion and my mother being like, why do you read this? This woman, she dies, she doesn't have sex. This is, I fought for women's right to have sex. Why do you read this? I'm a feminist and this is what I've done. So she was, but because I think it's interesting that she fought that way because she doesn't see her as a heroine of refusal, because I see her as a way of resisting all that has been imposed on her by the king, by her mother, by her husband. She's always fighting, but it's not something we teach in the classroom about her. We teach about gallantry or we teach about something else, but we don't, focus on her refusal. So thank you for this question, though.
You talked about the fact that fairy tales were written first by women and then by men. So I was wondering, how do the different versions differ? And what caused the rewriting of the fairy tales by men?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So basically, for instance, if you take the Little Red Riding Hood, that's my first chapter. The way that the Grimm brothers rewrote that version, and most of the time that the version we tell children, because I don't remember, I don't know if you remember the Grimm version, but basically they say, oh, Little Red Riding Hood, she was eaten by a wolf, and then there's this hunter who comes, who liberates the good guy, who liberates Little Red Riding Hood and the grandmother, and at the end say, oh, Little Red Riding Hood, next time you shouldn't disobey your mother, you should do that. So it's, there is this Christian morality that women, they disobey and they are bad women, right? So that has nothing to do with the folkloric version I analyze, because she saved herself. She doesn't need a man to save herself. And it has nothing to do with the wolf being the main subject of the fable. And it's about transmission. It's about, 3 generations of women, the mother, the grandmother, the daughter. So basically, when you read the version of the female fairy tales of the women. It's all about female agency, the power of refusal, liberating yourself, fighting. Also, you have some fairy tales that portray women who fight. They wear male costumes in order to fight, because to be taken seriously. So it's very interesting to compare the two. And why did men took over those fairy tales? Because it worked, because it's also a good way to educate children. Now I'm a mother. I love it when say, oh, children, you should listen to your parents, piece of advice, and don't disobey. And, they also reward those versions towards children, as a way to educate young children. So I don't know if I answer your question. Okay, thank you.
We have a Zoom, excuse me, we have a Zoom question. Shirley has identified a French playwright that we haven't turned to yet. Shirley would like you to comment on some of Molieres' women, and in particular, Elmire from Tartuffe.
Oui, very good question. Thank you, Shirley. I don't see you, but no, so Molière is a very complex playwright. It's very interesting because we love Molière, and at the same time, he does different things. So Elmire is really a strong character in Tartuffe, because she's basically the one who, saves the situation and finds a solution, and she has a lot of agency. So I devoted an article about Elmire, or a talk about her, because she's very interesting in order to play with Tartuffe, desires. So Molière is very complex, because at the same time is also, but if you look at Elmire, she's, the wife of Orgon. She stays at home. She has a domestical role, even though she's very interesting and she has some agency. But it's also interesting that women who claim to have some knowledge, such as les femmes savantes ou les précieuses ridicules, who are interested in reading, because les précieuses ridicules, actually, they read Madeleine de Scudéry. So these are women who read other women. So Molière is always making fun of them. So it's a good question, because I'm currently trying to write another book, and I have a whole chapter on Molière. But I think it's an interesting playwright for sure. But interesting because complex. Yeah.
Well, yes.
Hi, hello. So you mentioned the Me Too movement, and you talked a little bit about the notion of consent and gallantry, but I would like to hear your opinion on how has Me Too movement affected the notion of consent in the US versus in France. You do live in the US, but I'm sure you are following, or you're still French.
Yeah.
So how do you see, where has it moved better in terms of consent when it comes to situation of women, in your opinion?
It's a very complex question. It was, of course, very important to, I think, not liberating the voice, because I speak about that in the introduction, because women always said no. So they didn't, it was not a movement that liberating the voices in general. Some women, it liberates, some women felt they were able to say things, but I think it definitely changed the way people listen to what women said. And so I think that one of the great benefits of Me Too is that we cannot speak about rape. It's not a bad word, like it's not a taboo word. I remember living in a society where it was never possible to speak about that. And I remember a professor at Stanford one day who came to me and told me, Jennifer, actually, women are raped a lot more than you think. I said, well, a lot more than you think, right? But it was very interesting because he was whispering to me. And but now we don't whisper. So I think that's good. The second thing that is also very important is that for personally, I felt authorized to write this kind of books where I think I would have not done. And a lot of people I know felt authorized to write what they wanted to write. And in that sense, I think it's liberating. But I think it's also changing in some police stations that people are like some policemen now, they are trained to listen better when women come to see them. It has definitely changed something in the classroom, because in the US where I teach those texts with trigger warnings, a lot of people confessed what happened to them, and they went further. They took some, actions. They went to the police station. They did things that they wouldn't have done because they were a safe place to speak about those things. So I think it has been changing some to some extent, but it's still an ongoing process. I don't know what is your impression on it, but I mean, on both sides of the Atlantic, I think things are changing, but slowly.